Fantastic. So I think we can get started, if I can get your attention and quiet. Thank you. So a very warm welcome to this IPPR event. I'm Carys Roberts, I'm Executive Director here at IPPR. And it's my pleasure to be chairing this event on Faster, Fairer, Greener, a green industrial strategy. Very big thank you to SSE, who we're partnering with on this event, which is a real pleasure. And Rachel here is Chief Sustainability Officer at SSE. We also have on our panel today Johnny Reynolds, MP, Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Industrial Strategy. I have Kate Bell, who is Assistant General Secretary at the TUC, and also George Dibb, who is Head of the Centre for Economic Justice at IPPR. In terms of what we wanted to talk about today, I think there are kind of two key things that really set the scene. One is that we are entering the crucial decade for environmental action. So while the UK has done more than many in reducing its emissions, tangible progress towards its climate goals is increasingly lacking, which is a kind of understatement of the century following the past weeks. And progress on our wider environmental targets are weak. And at the same time, so the other kind of key challenge we want to address is the profound economic crisis facing the UK. And that's partly about productivity and growth not being strong enough. And we've heard over the past few days Labour's commitment to increasing growth. But it's also the nature of that growth and whether it's being shared across the country and whether it's sustainable for the long term. So what I'm hoping today, we've heard lots about green industrial strategy. I'm hoping that we can get into some of the key questions of how that can address these twin crises of the environment and our economic weaknesses. So I'm going to turn to our speakers for some opening remarks. We'll have a bit of discussion and then we'll open it up to the audience. So do please be thinking of your questions as we proceed. Johnny, I'd like to come to you first. That's okay, let you drink your water.
Is this mic on? Great. Well, thank you, Carys, and thank you, first of all, for all the work that IPPR does, which is obviously always of considerable use to me because of all the issues that you work on are directly relevant to my brief. I wanted to say a particular thank you to George, actually, because George, you are one of the leading lights on industrial strategy. I think that is fair to say. You were here before it was as cool as it is. And, I mean, I have to say, you know, for people who are interested in this has been a phenomenal conference for this. I mean, like every fringe I've been at, on manufacturing, on industrial strategy, on the transition, has been standing room only. In fact, I'm looking at some of you thinking, are you the same people who've been at all of those fringes? Are we like a community of people? We're going to form our own Labour Friends of Industrial Strategy, but which I would join, which would be clear. If you're interested in setting that up, we would be here. But look, it's brilliant. And then to see, you know, obviously the speech we've just listened to by Kay, which I thought was absolutely phenomenal, talk about these things. You know, industrial strategy, stronger employment rights, working alongside better investment and a partnership with business, getting a chair on conference floor. I'm very much here for all of that. So look, it's been a great conference in that regard, and thank you to an audience like this for you know, making it a priority. I know there are lots of competing fringes you could otherwise go to, but I'll start off by saying, look, we are clearly living in an age of reborn industrial strategy. That is the picture around the world. And actually, you know, much of that by default is green, because whether it's the aerospace sector, the automotive, steel, the predominant question of industrial strategy is how will you decarbonise? And maximising the opportunities of net zero is exactly what Labour policy is about. We disagree fundamentally with Rishi Sunak's change of direction and speed of policy. And actually, if you look around the world, you talk to any business who are present here at this conference, that is how they see it too. And you know, at the heart of the Sunak speech is obviously something which is going to cost people money. There's no question of that. If you live in private rented accommodation, you know, the imperative to sort that out, to have a more efficient property, that will cost you money over the long term. But fundamentally, as well, it has wrecked business confidence. And to give the sort of specific example of the automotive sector, because we launched our sector plan at this conference, I mean, if you go back to the start, a date at which you would want to see the phase out of new petrol and diesel vehicles, you could have argued for a year between 2030 and 2035. Having picked a year, you absolutely do need to stick to it. And the most foolish thing of all for the government to do is to change the target at the end of that but keep all the ZEV mandate, the ramp up towards that, so you've got kind of half and half of each policy, and then people will reasonably say, well, look, given the investment cycles around the transition, around a faster, fairer, greener future, how can we possibly make a decision like that with regard to the UK if we can't trust a word of government policy? So, I mean, the starting point you've got to say is, if we want to do this, let's not do it as the government are doing it, you know. And I think that theme has been very strong throughout our conference. I think, you know, we've got to acknowledge that in the main, for this subject, this is a question of investability. You know, a lot of the technology, not all of it, but most of the technology and the innovation is there. But what you haven't got yet is the proposition that is going to attract the level of investment that is required to make that a reality. So I suppose the question for a panel like this is, well, how are we going to fix it if we get the chance to do so? So the first thing I'll say in response to what we've seen recently is certainty. It is stability. I mean, I know that isn't, you know, I said another fringe like this, you know, it's not going to be on climate banners. It doesn't sound particularly dynamic and sexy, but it is essential. And a big part of our industrial strategy is designed not just to give the words, the commitments that are necessary for that, but what kind of institutions will give people confidence to do that. The second thing is catalytic public investment. This is our green prosperity plan that gets quite rightly a lot of attention. But for steel, for automotive, you're going to need a degree of public investment. You can't expect the private sector to do it on its own. And interestingly, the government does accept this. I mean, we've seen the announcements in terms of the gigafactory for Tata in Somerset. We have seen the decision around Port Talbot. But what we haven't really seen it from the government is a coherent, transparent policy around that. I mean, what is their criteria? What are they seeking? As Keir said in his speech, how will they protect the public investment? We know what we want in exchange for that. And actually, you know, again, going back to myself and Rachel yesterday, if the public were to think that decarbonisation was about deindustrialisation, well, that would be a disaster. You know, you wouldn't have the consent required to do that. Thirdly, look, this is not just about money, however. Look, and that was, I suppose, the most dishonest thing in the Rishi Sunak speech, because when he's saying each household is going to need to spend £20,000, well, look, first of all, I think we can probably be reaching agreement that we weren't all planning to have 7 bins, you know, that we weren't all planning to adjust to the meat tax, and I certainly never, you know, if I was forced to car share, I'd pick a lovely group of people like this, but again, that wasn't on the cards. But of course, the purpose of policy in this area is not to force people to bear those costs now. It is to create markets, it is to drive up deployment, it is to have the scale of that deployment then driving down the cost. It's to set the direction and work with the private sector around that. And we do have, as a country, some good examples of that. The offshore wind story is not perfect. It's certainly not in terms of domestic content and jobs, but in terms of price, it is remarkable what has happened. It's one of the few areas where there has been some stability, and, you know, again, we could do with a lot more of that. Fourth thing I'll say, Carys, just by way of opening remarks, there are clearly a lot of wider horizontal industrial policies that are required across the board in the UK, but which are essential to this agenda. So industrial energy prices are prohibitive in the UK. We cannot avoid that. The government have the supercharger policy. Maybe it's interesting, but we'll have to see. Skills policy, you know, the skills of the workforce, one of the biggest issues if we're going to get the transition to happen at all. We've got our policies there around the apprenticeship levy and Skills England and further devolution. The planning system, which has got, again, such a focus of conference, particularly in Rachel's speech, that needs huge change. And things like grid regulation, again, they sound quite granular, they don't sound very exciting, but they are massive issues for any business you talk to about getting it right. So the agenda is wide, it is rich, but at the heart of it, you know, and this is, again, the big difference between ourselves and the government, we see this as an opportunity, one that is good for business, that is good for workers, is fundamentally about good jobs, good wages in every part of the country, and we are absolutely committed to making it happen.
Fantastic. That's very good to hear, Johnny. I'll turn now to our other panellists, and Kate, I wanted to come to you next.
Great. Thanks so much, Carys, and thanks for inviting me to the first inaugural meeting of the Labour Friends of Industrial Strategy. I just want to take a minute to propose my colleague Mika as its possible next president. She's at the back here. She's done a huge amount of the TUC's work in this area, including producing this excellent leaflet which sets out some of our policies. But rather than summarise the leaflet, I'm just going to try and make 3 quick points. So the first is, obviously, this green industrial strategy is absolutely vital. And it's vital not just to meet our climate targets, which is becoming more evident, the urgency of by the day, but also to protect and save jobs here in the UK as well, because we're being left behind. Our estimates, Mika's estimates, show that between 600 and 800,000 jobs in the UK are at risk of being offshored because other countries are putting in place the support to decarbonise. So if you're in a high carbon industry, steel, cement, automotive, if you're located abroad, you're getting subsidies to decarbonise. If you're here in the UK, you are being left behind, and investors are increasingly looking at us and thinking, well, hang on, am I going to put the new jobs here or not? So it's not just about the jobs of the future, and it's really important we do talk about the jobs of the future too, but it's about those high energy jobs of today as well. So that's point number one. Point number two, it is really, really important that as we transition, and some of those jobs will be transitioning to new forms of production, we will have new jobs as well. We have a strong flow of rights, and those jobs are good jobs. So we talk about the just transition, and some of that is about industrial strategy policy, but it's also about the flow of rights we have right across our economy. And that's why we think, and it was really good to hear Keir say this, that strong employment rights are good for growth. Yeah. Labour's New Deal for workers, that ban on zero-hours contracts, stronger rights for trade unions to negotiate decent terms and conditions, those are absolutely vital to protecting jobs, to protecting decent jobs, and to making sure that the jobs of tomorrow, as well as the jobs of today, are decent with fair pay and terms and conditions. And I was just thinking a little bit about the kind of nature of this debate and how we are, you know, how the Conservatives are trying to kind of ramp up this, it's all about costs. And thinking about how different this debate would be if we hadn't had 13 years of a cost of living crisis, 13 years of kind of low growth, 13 years of your wages going absolutely nowhere. That's the context in which, you know, anything that looks like change, anything that comes from government is seen as a danger, it's seen as bad for you, because that's what has happened to people's incomes over the last 13 years. Government has held them down. If we had a government that was boosting them, I think the nature of this debate and the way we saw opportunities from, you know, the climate transition would have a really different tone, and that's another reason why it's so important. Last point, and it will be quick. Just if we're going to get this right and we're going to realise these benefits, we've got to have a different way of doing business in the UK. And part of that is about the partnership approach that Johnny has talked about, business working with unions and government, exemplified on this panel. But also it is about business being long-term as well as government. And I think one of the key things we want to talk about is reforms to our business system that take away the culture of short-termism in UK business. So we've called for reforms of the Companies Act, so businesses don't just have to maximise shareholder value. We've called for workers to be on companies' boards so we can embed that partnership approach in the boardroom too. And I think thinking a little bit about how we do business in the UK, as well as the type of businesses we're developing, is also really critical to delivering the agenda. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. Rachel, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. And thanks very much for having us here today, and it's really nice to meet the panel. I thought I would say two things by way of introduction, and I've got two hats on. I'm Chief Sustainability Officer of SSE, but I also have been a Commissioner on Scotland's Just Transition Commission for the last 4.5 years. So I'm going to start with the company hat. And SSE is a large British power company. I like to think you could think of us as a good example of a company in transition. So, 10, 15 years ago, we were a company that had coal, gas and hydro. Now we no longer have coal generation. And what we're trying to do is we've pinned our colours to the net zero mast. And what we're trying to do is to get to a point where we are completely decarbonised, probably around 2035, 2040. So I suppose the thing that we've all got in violent agreement on is that we're all very much agreed that we need a decarbonised power sector, probably around 2030, 2035. And we agree on this because of all the cases for it. There's a social case because it's affordable. There's no question that green energy is cheaper than every other type of energy. There's an economic case because there should be jobs and prosperity. There's a security case because we rely less on others for our energy. And of course, there's the overwhelming climate case too. Now, the company I work for is involved in lots of things, but in particular, we're in the business of building wind farms and transmission infrastructure. I'm just going to give you a few examples. Right now, we're building a wind farm on Shetland that will be the most productive wind farm in Europe, but it's taken us 18 years to get to this point. We've got an offshore wind farm off the Angus coast that's taken 13 years, although we're just about to commission it, so we're quite pleased with that. And the last time we built an onshore transmission line of scale, it took the best part of a decade. And that sense of urgency and imperative is something that me and my colleagues feel every single day. We feel like we're right on the front line of all of this. Now, yesterday, to be more positive, we achieved first power at what will be the world's largest offshore wind farm. This is a £9 billion wind farm that was done in collaboration with 2 other partners. Yesterday was the first of 277 turbines that's up and connected to the grid, and it's producing power. Only another 276 to go. But this project is loaded with innovation firsts. First of a kind turbine, first of a kind installation vessel. We had a joke in the company was that we were going to need a bigger boat. The first of a kind high voltage connection. And from the perspective of us and our partners, the point of these firsts are not that that's the last time we'll just be doing it the once. We need to do it over and over again. And for Labour to achieve what it set out by 2030, then we're probably going to need another 10 of those delivered in 6 years. That's the scale of what we're talking about. But the challenge of this is twofold. Yes, we've got to definitely do this much faster, whilst also being respectful of the multitude of important stakeholders who have an interest. There's a lot of people that care about this stuff. And the second challenge is delivering value, which kind of picks up to the industrial strategy point, so that local people and their communities feel the benefit from all this activity, which I guess brings me just briefly to my second hat. So I've been on this commission in Scotland for the last 4.5 years. It is, I suppose, what you might describe in its best sense, social dialogue. Trade unions, environmentalists, industrialists. We have given oodles of advice to the Scottish Government, and every single bit of that advice has been achieved in consensus, something that if you'd been at our first evidence gathering session you would not have believed would be possible, but we got there. And what we've said is that there's just so much to be done. There's no doubt supply chains are constrained, so if ever there was like a reason to grow them here now, it's because there isn't enough to go around, so let's get them here. And that means we need to do things like investments in ports and harbours. We need some serious workforce planning. I made this point yesterday, but there are 14-year-olds now that we know need to be high voltage engineers in 2030. So let's get this organised. And then what I would say is that there needs to be some conditionality onto the companies so that they deliver social and economic value too. I think I'll leave it at that. I've got other examples, but I'll come to them later.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rachel. It's great to hear those examples, and good luck with the 276. George, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Carys, and thank you to SSE for supporting it, and for so many people coming. It's kind of ridiculous if you've been working on industrial strategy for quite a while to see a conference room packed and like people spilling out into the corridor to hear a discussion about industrial policy. But it really speaks to the current moment, the fact that industrial policy is so popular, not just at this conference hall, not just in the UK policy-making circles more broadly, but around the world. The US and the EU also are taking steps in the same direction. And it's partly through a realization that having a strategic approach to our economy and to our economic makeup and the industries within it is really the only way that we can actually capture the economic upside of the transition to net zero. It's a fundamental part of the transition. Because I'm an industrial strategy geek, I think we need industrial strategy if we didn't even have to do the net zero transition. We still need industrial strategy to grow the economy and ensure we have fair jobs. But the transition to net zero makes it absolutely essential. We have to shift our economy from one state to another, from a high carbon emitting system to a low carbon emitting one. And that requires a long-term approach and a coordinated approach which individual businesses simply can't or won't do themselves. And the state has to do more. I think it's popular around the world, and it's popular also across different sides of the political spectrum too. I mean, we're here at Labour Conference. It's great to hear Keir and Rachel and Johnny and Darren, all people talking so clearly that industrial strategy is not just an important part of their policy programme, but also part of their vision for how the UK economy will change under a Labour government. But also industrial strategy is increasingly popular on the right as well around the world. So, I mean, the Conservative Party in the UK love industrial strategy so much, they've had 11 of them in 13 years. But seriously, policymakers on the right in the US, so Oren Cass, Marco Rubio, a former Republican presidential candidate equally, has made some pretty astonishing kind of proposals around what a manufacturing made in the US plan should look like. These are signs of a serious shift in policy making, and I think it's more than just a pendulum swinging backwards and forwards on what the role of the state should be, but a realization that we need to take just a longer term approach to our economy. And then that around the world point. So we shouldn't ignore what's going on in the EU. As policymakers, we tend to be very blinkered in terms of looking at only English-speaking countries. There are some really interesting developments going on in the EU. The Next Gen EU programme is ploughing significant amounts of money into the development of new chip fabs or solar cell PV, silicon wafer facilities, and they're doing it in areas that are previously economically deprived. So Europe's largest PV facility is, they've broken ground. I think it's just about to open in Sicily. But the US is really the thing that everybody's looking at the most, right? With the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act that Johnny mentioned already, have really set the bar, and the UK so far has failed to step up to that. There is a danger that even if Labour were to win a general election in a year's time and do this, that might be too late. We think we do need to step up to the competition on industrial policy. But what would an Inflation Reduction Act for the UK actually mean? We cannot just do what the US has done. Nor, frankly, would we want to, because it's really badly designed. You wouldn't do it that way because they had to do it that way, because it's politically constrained. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act because they had to convince one bloke in the Senate that he had to vote for it. But as a consequence, they cut out loads of really good policy. So in the US, you can't pass climate regulation, for example. So that means you can't take a carrot and stick approach. So IRA therefore has to be really weighted towards carrots and giving away huge uncapped budgets, up to even $1 trillion potentially. And we should do different in the UK. We should take a carrot and stick approach. We have to transition whole sectors. That means we should put in place incentives that the leaders in the sectors will strive for, but we also need regulation to drive the laggards too. And that will also mean that we get better, more effective public spending because you get more bang for your buck if you can also use regulation. There's a risk, obviously, of Rishi Sunak potentially kind of smashing the climate consensus in the UK. International observers have said that our consensus on net zero is the UK's superpower, that political consensus, and it's very, very worrying that if that is to become a political dividing line. And then the other way that we should do an Inflation Reduction Act is that people have described the Inflation Reduction Act as technology neutral or technology agnostic. I don't think it is. I think it's technology specific, but technology specific in almost every different technology. So that's because they have they are able to do this. They have they're able to leverage the finance to make it happen. And they also have a more robust industrial base than the UK does, and we have to be frank about that. To do that properly means that we have to do that to do that properly, it means we have to do it in specific areas, and that means that we have to choose. But of course, to govern is to choose, and that will be the job of a future Labour government. So I think those two points are really important. But I think what is absolutely clear is that we at IPPR and a lot of people in this room think that a green industrial strategy is absolutely critical to a fairer, faster, and greener transition for the economy.
Fantastic, thank you, George. I have a few questions for each of you, and then we'll open up. And Johnny, I wanted to start with you because there has been this, huge spell of enthusiasm for industrial strategy. But over the past few days, if I have heard a kind of word of caution, is this, and that's that even if you do this really well, you create all the jobs you plan to, etc., that's still going to be quite a small proportion of the economy. And so how can, is the goal of this to benefit a large proportion of the economy and society? How do you make that happen?
great question. I thought you were going to say for a minute there's been this groundswell of support, and do you take personal credit for Labour conference swinging behind this, which that's very kind, Carys. Look, you're right. I mean, first of all, an industrial strategy, as George said, it's integral to doing this, but you wouldn't just focus it on this. I mean, obviously there's an incredible services sector in the UK. There's parts of manufacturing, food manufacturing that are really important sources of good jobs, and it has to work for everything. But when we talk about creating new jobs, I mean, let's start with the imperative, which is if we didn't do this, we'll lose a lot of jobs. I mean, the nonsense about the phasing out of petrol and diesel vehicles from the government. I mean, look, it's pretty straightforward, the numbers on this. This country has a thriving automotive sector. It's a jewel in the crown. 80% of what we make is exported. 70% of those exports go to countries that already have these policies in place. So if you're not doing it, you're not going to sell it. No one's going to buy what you're making. It's as straightforward as that. So you've got to recognise, and the same is true with steel. I mean, people want, clearly the decarbonisation of steel is essential. I mean, Scunthorpe and Port Talbot alone, those two plants are 15% of the entire industrial emissions of the UK. That's how the footprint is so large. But the market wants green steel. People want things built, and they want to say this is the standard because that's what their customers ultimately want. So the market is there, but the costs are so big that you risk just missing out on that base being here. And we should say this actually more. The world is going to get to this point. The question is, what will be the economic footprint in the UK? What will we get from it? So you start from that position. I'd also say that you get asked a lot as a prospective business sector. Which is your favourite sector of the economy? I feel like it's like saying, which of your children do you love the most? It's. I find that it's quite odd. I mean, it's quite an odd question, really, if you think about it. But to even have a favourite sector would be odd. But it's not a choice, right? Because where you have a strong manufacturing base, there'll be a thriving services sector around there because people have got money to spend on those services. You'll have a great retail and hospitality again. They all go together. So I think there is no doubt on the transition, whether that is big industrial emissions or getting the UK's housing stock up to where it needs to be, that you then have a lot of jobs created within that. But look, at the heart of what really creates good jobs, if we, for the first time in our history, had for instance, an electricity supply which was secure, was low carbon, and was low cost, as is feasible if you think we might decouple from the price of gas in the long term for electricity generation. We've never had all three of those things. We had a coal-based system that was obviously for a while two of those things, but obviously not low carbon. Similar story with natural gas. So, the benefits to the economy of the whole, and, cities with better air, cleaner air, more livable places to live in, far less health problems from the UK's leaky homes. I mean, all these sound pretty good to me, to be honest, beyond the immediate industrial footprint that they would bring. But also, look at our services sector, look at financial services. There are huge markets in financing the transition, in the kind of, I often say when Conservative MPs talk about this in a very abstract future way, well, look, I mean, in my constituency, we have had in a couple of parts of it such serious flooding in the last few years that the insurance costs that people face are in many cases extortionate. So first of all, it's not a problem for the future. This is happening right now, but how we, for instance, protect against climate risks, how the insurance industry does that's part of this too. So you start to dig into it, and yes, away from what might be seen as the most kind of in the public eye, very big industrial issues to resolve. Actually, I think you get pretty quickly to the whole of the economy that is part of this. But again, I suppose an industrial strategy is for the whole of the economy, for the benefit of the whole of the economy, but it's just a reality to say for many sectors, there is a huge decarbonisation aspect of that, so you have to include that as well.
Great, thank you. Rachel, my question for you is actually to see if you could pick up a point that Kate made, which is that we do need more businesses who are acting for the long term, or indeed perhaps more companies who are in transition, which is how you described SSE. What do you think could achieve that?
So the truth is I only represent my own company, so it is difficult for me to say how you achieve that. What I would say is that as a company, we have thought quite hard about this. So we are a long-term company. I mean, I laugh a little bit. There's very few companies that can say that they depreciate some of their assets over 100 years, but we have some assets that we depreciate over 100 years because we've got hydroelectricity. And the transmission and distribution investments we're making just now are 40 years. And the wind farms are 25 years. And actually, some of the early onshore wind farms we're hoping to repower and to extend that. So we're definitely a long-term company. I also understand the point that Kate's making about the Companies Act and this notion of hierarchy relating to shareholder and stakeholders. And this is something that we also thought about quite carefully as a company in our own world, and we put in our purpose statement that and our strategy that we seek to create value simultaneously for shareholders and society. And what we came to the conclusion is because we are a private company acting in the public interest. So we thought very hard about this, and we came to the conclusion that the only way that we could meet our shareholders' expectations was if we were meeting the requirements of our stakeholders. So that was the conclusion that we came to. And I don't know if you were aware at the time that the future of the corporation work that was done. So this notion of what is business for, and it was kind of like an antidote to the idea that Friedman said. I mean, I know I'm getting a bit philosophical, but I actually think this is important, that all that business was for was to make a profit within the rules of the land. That was, and of course, most good businesses do not think that. And this Future of the Corporation project that was established by the British Academy said the purpose of business is to find the profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and never to be in the business of creating those problems in the first place. And that was a mantra and an ethos that we've embraced as a company, because that's what we're here for, to find the profitable solutions. You know, obviously within limits, we've regulated utility and all those sorts of things, and that's what the conclusion we came to. So I'm not commenting on other businesses because that's not my thing, but I can see how we thought about it.
That's fascinating to hear. Kate, you also talked about partnership working, and I wondered if you could say a bit more about what that should look like, and in particular, if there are examples around the world of where it's been working well.
Thank you. Yeah, and it was great to hear that from Rachel, really fascinating, and I didn't know about that at SSE. So I guess we think that you need kind of a partnership and an approach to negotiation, and sometimes it is negotiation at basically every level. So that means at company level, and around many countries in the world, you do have stronger bargaining rights at a company level, so workers have a direct stake in how the company is managed, what it does, what transition plans they might have in place. We think at a sectoral level, and Labour's put a kind of toe in that water with a fair pay agreement in social care, thinking about how you can negotiate across a whole sector. And then we think you need those social partnership institutions at national level. And of course, Labour has set out a National Economic Council, an Industrial Strategy Council, that the Skills England will be a partnership approach between business, workers, and government. So a really promising set of institutions there. And I think what we sort of forget is this is just completely normal in most other developed economies around Europe. You know, practically the whole of Europe is covered by sectoral bargaining institutions. Most other European countries have some kind of national economic body where these decisions are made. You know, Germany has put in place a number of kind of commissions, a coal commission thinking about their transition away from coal. Not an easy issue at all, but, you know, a negotiated set of policies where those interests actually got to have a kind of say. And there's a phrase, I can't remember where it comes from, and someone on this panel will be able to tell me, that kind of the UK economy is uniquely a disorganised economy. But at the moment, that is really characteristic, and it's just not what happens elsewhere, basically. And I think, you know, those institutions that Labour have set out are starting to get it right, but there is a lot we can learn from this just being very, very normal in most other places, most other developed economies.
And sorry to continue to be down on Britain, but I've travelled in the US and also to Brussels over the past year to speak with people working on green industrial strategy in those places. And it is just clear from what they're doing that they're much bigger entities. They, as you say, George, particularly in the US, they can invest in lots of different technologies and sectors and so on. How can the UK find its niche in the green transition and in the industries of the future?
Sure. So I think there are different ways you can approach the question, and many economists or conventional economists would probably approach it from a pretty narrow competitiveness or comparative advantage approach, which is, what do we do more patents of in the UK, or what do we export for cheaper than our competitors? The problem with that is that comparative advantage is not static. You can choose you can't choose your comparative advantage, but you can choose to change it, or you can choose to try to be good at different things. Many of the areas that the UK has strong comparative advantage in have been supported by government policy for decades. So recognizing that comparative advantage is dynamic and changes over time is important. I think there's also just a pretty obvious, what you could dress up as being strategy, but the UK is an island, so it makes sense for us to do offshore wind and try to be good at offshore wind. It's worth recognizing that the UK's approach to offshore wind is taught in universities as an example of bad public policy. We have been catastrophically poor at capturing the economic upside of the boom in offshore wind. The UK is one of the world's leading installers of offshore wind turbines, and yet at the same time as we were inventing a whole new policy tool in contracts for difference, which led to private sector investment, which grew the size of turbines, made them cheaper and more efficient. We invented that in the UK, and it led to us becoming a leader in installing. We were also letting the UK's only wind turbine manufacturer go bankrupt when they were crying out for public support. We failed to join up in a strategic way the industrial economic part of the decarbonisation policy, and we cannot repeat that mistake again. If anything, all this conversation around industrial strategies try to not make that mistake again. And then there's kind of what are the metrics you use, but also how do you make the decision? And in the US, they have, even with the resources of the American state, they have struggled to really understand what the American economy is good at. They, from speaking to people who were in the White House making these decisions, they, and this will be music to the ears of many attendees in this room, they had to reach out to trade associations across the economy, because those are the people who knew in the US where industrial capacity was. That was not within the state. And that is certainly true in the UK. We used to have a 50-person industrial strategy directorate in Bays, and when Rishi Sunak moved that from Bays to the Treasury, he disbanded a 50-person directorate and replaced it with 0.5 of one-person FTE within the Treasury. So the state capacity in the UK to make these decisions is extremely weak. So to Kate's point, really, we need to, a critical part of doing this right will be building the infrastructure within government to make these decisions. It will mean reforming institutions like the OBR or the Treasury to get money out where it's needed. And it will mean building out other things like various councils and stakeholder engagement to actually understand what the UK is doing. It was an example in Brexit. When the UK left the European Union, we basically had no idea what we exported or imported every year. It was just, nobody knew. And that's not the case in Japan. In the Japanese government, they know what they import and export. It's just the pretty basic stuff you have to do to actually make good decisions.
Fantastic. Johnny, I think you wanted to come in.
I mean, I'll be 3 quick points, but it's relevant to the conversation very much. I mean, on purpose, look, I absolutely agree with Kate and Rachel's call for long-termism. I think that, you know, that fundamental rejection of the Friedmanite view. Let's get into the philosophy, because I think if we do have a Labour Friends of Industrial Strategy, we'd probably put that on the Articles of Association, I'd imagine. But you know, I think, to be frank, we as a Labour Party have had to rebuild our credibility with business. And actually, you've got to be quite careful as a prospective Labour business owner. You don't look preachy. I don't look like, in the same way you want to talk about other businesses, I don't want to look like I'm telling you how to run things. But I think what is genuinely interesting is, you know, a lot of the request for this, it actually comes in the main from business, as well as obviously colleagues like Kate at the TUC. But to make sure that isn't tokenistic and is giving people the proper menu of tools that they need, I think that is a conversation all of us should be part of. And I agree with George as ever on the comparative advantage. I mean, if you look at, I've, for instance, done some work trying to map where are there gaps in what the US is subsidising, and there aren't many gaps, but you know, they've thrown a lot of money at things, but are there gaps that match then things that we are already good at in the UK. Now, you know, I think definitely on AI and quantum and machine learning, you can see some examples of that. But I do think your point about there are tools available to us in a country like the UK that politically just would never happen in the US that make it relevant. And you know, on carbon capture, I think our cluster system is actually the right way to do that if the proposition is good. And finally, on your point on exports and imports, I mean, look, I would say that was absolutely right what you said there about Brexit, but also it still applies today. I mean, the government's trade strategy is basically just to do lots of trade deals to show we're not in a customs union anymore. I mean, there's no real, there's no stated policy goals to what we're trying to achieve. How could you assess, really that politically the deals are kind of like, do you like Australia? They've done a trade deal, rather than what were you trying to achieve? And the Board of Trade is not, like, for instance, the Swedish Board of Trade, a serious group of people analysing and explaining to the public, because really these are political decisions within countries, not between countries. Some of your sectors are going to face higher competition, others will get more opportunities. That is what a trade deal fundamentally will deliver. So I think you're right to point out, in the context of leaving the European Union, but actually for the future, I'd say that's even more important in a way.
Fantastic. So, Johnny, I know you need to leave in 15 or 20 minutes. So I'm going to ask anyone asking a question to be brief, if possible. I think we have a roving mic here with my colleague Emma. And I'll start with the lady in red near the door.
Considering the UK is a tidal island, why aren't we investing in tidal? Because I know there's some plans for onshore wind, but that's a planning headache waiting to happen. But anyone who... I live in London. You try to build council housing, the middle class erupt in the complaints of it being too near. I can just imagine the same of onshore wind.
Fantastic.
Also, one last quick thing. This green industrial revolution needs to be up north in the ex-industrial towns that factories are destroyed, not just for the green thing, it also helped the bloody economy. The higher paying jobs, more tax-paying money, all that thing. And people also have money to spend on luxuries, which also equals that.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'll take the gentleman here. Sorry, Em, to make you run around. Just over here at the front.
Hi, Ajay Alawalia, Head of Supply Chain at Renewable UK. Sorry, George, we're going to pick you up on something. Look, I mean, I'm the first person to say that in terms of potential, the UK's got so much that it can do with regards to offshore wind, and I've worked in the industry for over 13 years. And I would direct people to my recent supply chain capability analysis report, which identifies over £92 billion of GVA that can be added to the UK economy by 2040. But look, I think one of the key things you've identified here is the cost of energy with regards to those high energy intensive industries such as green steel and decarbonisation or low carbon concrete as well. Can the panel reflect on how the cheap renewable energy can be directly connected, or indeed through virtual power purchase agreements, or indeed direct private wires be connected to those industrial clusters, so we can see some of that cheap low carbon material and supply chain and sort of come to be. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I'll take one over here.
Thanks. Jonathan Selwyn, Bluefield Group. We develop, build and operate solar and storage. Our industry has a short-term capital constraint at the moment, mainly because of high interest rates and uncertainty over government policy. But generally, we don't have capital constraints in the renewable sector for building new plant. So the question is, how will the industrial strategy complement the private sector investment rather than potentially, as was mentioned earlier, crowd it out or duplicate?
Fantastic. I think we'll pause there because we've got sort of 4 questions. One on why not invest in tidal, one on ex-industrial towns and how this can benefit the north, one on connecting cheap renewable energy to industrial clusters, and one on complementing the private sector. Johnny, do you want to go first? Okay,
I'm going to try, even though they're very detailed questions, and be quick, because I have been told at conference I give too long answers, and it's a character flaw you're going to have to bear with, but we're going to try and get everyone in. Okay, so look, on tidal, very exciting. I know there are interesting plans here, particularly on the Mersey around Liverpool. But look, on all these things, I say to people, yep, technology looks exciting. I can see the possibilities. The reality is you've got to deliver at a price, and some of those technologies will compete against each other because it's not my job or the job I want to eventually have to say I'll have that and I won't have that. I put the framework in place to secure the delivery of those things, but if someone else can do it more cheaply, they will get it if they can provide more for that price, but that's because we need to get it at the right price. And just on your very good point on ex-industrial towns, I mean, look, if you get this right, you almost do that by default. Look at the footprint of the steel industry, the chemical industry. Look at the opportunities around the Tees Valley, one of the best places to invest in renewables. So you get it right and you do that. Not for everywhere, it'll be different in places, but it's absolutely crucial. AJ's question on look, I mean, a lot of private wires do exist. I mean, the planning problems are there, but you would see that in Nissan with their onshore wind they've got, or a huge deployment of solar, particularly in the energy crisis around it. I mean, the cost. Going back to the earlier question, the cost of energy is crucial. I mean, that's the reality. It's not about what are the technologies you find most interesting, because everything to me is interesting, but the framework has to deliver it, and that's what we need to do. And actually, for a lot of for instance, the sites that would be the likely sites of electric battery factories, a lot of them have the potential specifically for that, because obviously the cost of energy would be so massive. And a great question down here about capital. I mean, look, the whole premise of what we put forward as a Labour Party, whether that is the National Wealth Fund, how that would manage public investment, or GB Energy, it is specifically about crowding in private investment. It's not about crowding it out. Rachel made that very clear in terms of the multipliers she would be looking for. There are also roles that, that in our current, the way our economy works, the unplanned nature of it, there are roles that just, aren't met. I mean, there will be some need, whatever we were to do with the North Sea, for, likely gas imports still in 2050. It'd be a much smaller amount than now, but, you could plan for that in a way that reduces your exposure to the price of that. There's no one really in the operating system that would do that. So there are rules for the state that complement the private sector, and that is fundamentally what we're trying to do. I hope that was short enough to fit everyone.
Absolutely. Kate, do you want to pick up this point about geography, and how can this benefit places across the UK?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I obviously sometimes the geography works, basically. So Johnny and George were talking about, use our natural advantages. And sometimes the geography works, so that offshore wind is going to be, or even onshore wind is going to be located near former industrial communities. But sometimes it's not going to work. And I think that's why it's so important that our good job strategy is not only a green industrial strategy, it's a good job strategy right across the economy. And that's why I was talking about the New Deal, because if you work in retail, your job should be a good high-paid job. If you work in logistics, your job should be a good high-paid job. If you work in social care, your job should be a good high-paid job. So it is vital that we are thinking how we can use the benefits of this transition to drive our productivity in the private sector, but it cannot be the only answer to improving jobs across the UK. And whatever sector of the economy you work in, you should feel that you've got a decent job, decent pay, decent terms and conditions, and a chance for progression. And then just one tiny point on the kind of crowding in, crowding out. Basically, I agree with Johnny, but also it's kind of hard to think of a worse investment climate than we've had in the UK for the last 10 years. So sometimes when I hear kind of, not from the question, but, GB Energy or any idea that the state takes a role is going to crowd out private investment, businesses have been on an investment strike for a decade. It couldn't get worse. And I think, it's pretty good signs that this will make it significantly better.
Great. Rachel, I wonder if you want to cover the cost of energy point and connecting industrial clusters.
Yes, do you mind if I also answer another one, if that's okay? I just... Yeah, thanks. I want to pick up on the place-based thing. I think this is really, really important, and I'm going to give you a practical example. So I said that we closed our last coal plant in 2020. That was in Warrington, and around the same time we started operating our offshore wind farm off the coast of Wick. Now, if you were trying to think of a just transition that the working people of Warrington could be offered a job in Wick, I'm not convinced we'd be offering them a lot of favours there, because you have to think place-based. Now, we're not closing any gas plant in Wick, but what Wick is got this juxtaposition to the North Sea continental shelf and there's oil and gas workers that are there. So this place-based thing, and this is one of the recommendations from the Commission to government, is that we need to ensure that there's capacity at a local level for these just transition partnerships, or some way of there being local leadership. And the example I wanted to give at Wick is that, so we have the wind farm that's there is called Beatrice Offshore Wind Farm. It is literally on the site of a former oil field. And the electrical energy from the wind farm over its lifetime is the equivalent of the electrical energy if you burnt oil to create electricity, if that makes sense. So the transition example of that is absolutely perfect. Now, the people that are working in our operational hub in Wick Harbour, 2/3 of them are former oil and gas workers. This is small. I'm not saying that this is, and it's not perfect. You know, would we have liked to have had more local content when we built it? Yes. But the point is that this is exactly the sort of thing that groups of people like us, government, trade unions and companies, need to be working together on over these months and years ahead to nail this at a place-based basis, I suppose. In terms of the question, in terms of basically how can we ensure that that cheap renewable energy is a stimulus for all sorts of other economic growth. Now, again, you're going to think I'm a bit bonkers drawing on this, but I've got a particular interest in the history of hydroelectricity and of some of the labour reforms of the post-war government. And what happened was that when they brought renewable electricity to the hills and glens of Scotland, there was also an industrial strategy. So there were aluminium plants, basically large users of electricity. And this is one of the things that I think we need to pull together, is what we're going to use it for as well, because that electricity is cheaper and there's going to be excess of it at certain times.
Fantastic. George, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a couple more questions so that Johnny can answer one or two more. And before he heads out. So please be very brief. I've got one here.
Thank you. Alex Riddle from the new constituency, Wetherby and Easingwold in Yorkshire. Johnny, you very kindly came to the Yorkshire and Humber Labour Business Forum event in Sheffield and answered a question about running towards the challenges of the future. We've talked about the example in America with the Inflation Reduction Act, but one of the great successes in the US has also been in research. So DARPA, ARPA-E, and not being government directing actively applied and basic research, not being afraid to fail, and actually creating the technologies that are absolutely pervasive in everything we do today. So I'd like to know from the IPPR and from Johnny, what can and what should Labour do to tackle the challenges of tomorrow in research?
Fantastic, thank you. And I'll take one more way over here.
Hi, Will Lord from the Aerospace Technology Institute. It was very encouraging to see Labour's green industrial strategy for the automotive sector during this conference. Can we expect similar strategies for other industries under a Labour government?
Fantastic. Do you want to take those two, Johnny?
Yes, I mean, I mean, you know, we can say it in a room like this. The Inflation Reduction Act gets all the attention, doesn't it? But the CHIPS Act is equally interesting. I think we would all agree on that. And I think that relationship between Josh laughing, the relationship between particularly higher education, you know, bodies like the Catapults, some of the research institutes, that is extremely interesting. And look, there were some hints, some bits in Keir's speech today about particularly long-term funding settlements, 10-year funding settlements, and linking that to the missions and how we deliver that. Because of Rishi Sunak's reorganisation of the business department, obviously that bit around UKRI and the research side of the department goes into the Department of Science and Technology, so Peter Kyle will take that up. But it's a big part of what we're thinking of as well, and effectively we have a longer term aspiration for a far more ambitious target in terms of R&D, public and private investment in R&D, and the idea is have that target, have longer budgetary periods, try and again give that certainty and consistency to align it with what you're trying to do, but let that evolve over time and do that. And just on the excellent question on sector plans, I can promise you that the automotive strategy is indeed the first one. It's a good example because it obviously brings together the need for the battery factories, the need for a better consumer offer, more consumer transparency, infrastructure around charging and how we'd use targets and devolve money in order to do that. big trade issues like rules of origin. So it's really good, tangible place to start. But yeah, we're going to do that for key sectors of the economy. We're already working on some of that. Open invitation to anyone, especially the IPPR, to come and get involved in some of that as well, because we know doing that work now obviously has a huge advantage. We'd ideally like to be having access talks at some point if the Prime Minister ever admits an election is imminent, to be able to sort of have the basis of those fundamental points there. So look, if you're interested in that, absolutely.
Awesome, thanks, Johnny. And I know you have to go in a minute, so do you have any kind of key takeaways of, something that you really want everyone to leave this room having heard?
Well, look, I think there's not a lot of dissent in the room in terms of what we're saying around around what needs to happen, but it's fascinating, right? I mean, the thing about this is it's not just about business in the economy, is it? It brings together actually issues of foreign policy. I mean, the Jake Sullivan speech, the National Security Advisor to Biden, his speech is really about how the US sees the world and how industrial strategy from America is at the heart of this now. Only downside was he mentioned about every country in the world except the UK. But this is from the energy bill you pay to the job you have to our relationship to other countries. This encapsulates it all. And other countries are currently doing it better than the UK. And actually, the fact that we have such a positive situation where unions, business, think tanks, members of the party, everybody, wants to see this. And actually, to be frank, if you were to talk to people who've been cabinet ministers in the last Labour government, they would say, in their own words, in their view, the last Labour government got to this too late. It got to this after the financial crisis and looked at, particularly, Peter Mandelson coming back from the European Commission, compared to other countries and realised we'd been a little bit hidebound by the doctrines of the past, rather than looking what was going on in other countries. So let's not be encumbered by that. Let's continue our Labour Friends of Industrial Strategy meetings, and let's make sure we do get it right, because I think absolutely integral to the transition, but absolutely integral to a better economy for everyone.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
And huge thanks to Johnny for his time. George, can you pick up this point on research?
Yeah, great to have a question from Weatherby, and great to be in a room where people want to discuss the organisational structure of the Defence and Advanced Research Projects Agency. There's lots to be said for linking up innovation within the industrial strategy, right? One of the big questions is, how do we harness and accelerate innovation which is going to be useful in either increasing the productivity of our economy or shifting it towards a societal goal that we know that we have. ARIA, which is the UK's version of DARPA, has a relatively small budget, but I don't think that's a big problem. I think that it's only one part of a much bigger R&D ecosystem. We shouldn't be expecting ARIA to do everything. It's become because Don Cummings invented it, we kind of treat it as like this thing. It's a really tiny fraction of the whole innovation budget. So I think we can do more in Innovate UK to support early stage firms in scaling up. I think what is missing from ARIA, though, is what made DARPA work in the US. And for people that don't know what DARPA is, it's basically like an agency that takes risky bets on innovation. They take a small number, and they know that 9 out of 10 will fail and nothing will ever come of it. But maybe that one that does come out will be transformational. And DARPA essentially invented the internet, so that sounds like a pretty good idea to me. But the reason that DARPA works is that it has explicitly around defence challenges. So all the projects are in the defence sector. ARIA doesn't have a similar kind of mission focus. It doesn't have a guiding light or something which motivates it. And I think having ARIA more structured around missions or grand challenges that we know we have to confront would be a much better way of motivating that, and as being the kind of lodestar of ARIA. And I think that net zero and green tech is clearly one of those. The one thing I would add is that there's the push of innovation, the funding, but you can also pull innovation through by being a purchaser of first resort or anything, or a whole range of different things. So there's a question out there of GB Energy and what role that should play in the sector. Should it invest just in early stage technologies or mature ones? But you can imagine a role for GB Energy in being a purchaser of first resort, creating new demand for these early stage technologies when their costs might be a bit high, but we know that by increasing the throughput, the learning by doing, the economies of scale, potentially in the future they might be cost competitive.
Fantastic, thank you. If people have them, I'm going to take one more round of questions and then we'll close after that. So there's a question at the back there.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, well, I think we'd all recognise that for an industrial strategy to be successful, it has to be long-term and, you know, sort of last for at least a decade. But the fact is, even if Labour wins the next election, the Tories could win the one after, right? So I don't know if you have any ideas on how you could design an industrial strategy so that it lasts no matter who's in government, so that the Tories can't come in and just scrap it.
Thank you very much. I thought I saw another hand at the back there. Yep, here we go.
It's not a question, it's a plea. I'm a party member, and my portfolio on Bury Council's environment. I've never known this interest in the environment. All the times I've been to the conference, and I think it shows we're serious. I've been in engineering for 45 years in Manchester, and a colleague there said it. I've seen factory after factory go. Where I worked, where my mum worked, where my dad worked, where my brother worked, gone, gone, gone. We've got the chance now to build on this green industrial revolution and to get manufacturing back in the UK. So please continue the good work. And we have a trade union colleague there. Please do it. Get the investment, get the jobs, and get manufacturing into Britain. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Hear, hear. I think there was one more question at the front, and then I'll come back to my panel.
A bit connected to the first question, the civil servants are going to be massively important in implementing all of this. How much access do you have to them? Are you talking it through with them, or is that just sort of kept at arm's length from you?
I think it was made easier by being made 0.5 FTE from the sounds of things. George, do you want to start first?
Yeah, so on the civil servants question, certainly IPPR works with civil servants across government, and as a charity work with political parties of all persuasions. But certainly you're right that the civil service will be really important. So we have an ongoing dialogue with civil servants who are working in the space. The political certainty one is a really, really great question. And you should look out for the forthcoming issue of IPPR's Progressive Review, where Greg Clark will be publishing a piece on how to get political certainty on a cross-party basis for industrial strategy. I think fundamentally, why do we find it, why is falling house prices so politically toxic across both parties? Why are we so scared of doing things like inheritance, of raising inheritance tax? Why do things become a cross-party consensus that's shared across both parties? It's because voters are either really like it or really hate it. And therefore, the challenge for building a political consensus around industrial strategy is building a coalition or a national group of people, a coalition of people who have benefited from it or are more prosperous as a consequence of it. You are right, though, that doing that takes time, right? Because it's about industrial development, investment, build out, job creation. So the time lag along that is the real challenge, and therefore the priority for Labour, I'm sure they're already thinking about this, is to find some of the quick, easy things that you can do early if low-hanging fruit. If we're so far behind other countries and low-hanging fruit does exist, we should seize that and try and get the tangible benefits quickly to try and start to build out that political coalition.
Fantastic. Rachel, over to you.
Yes, in terms of the question about how do you embed something for the long term, I mean, the most obvious answer to say is if it's really effective, then it's very difficult politically to abolish. But again, from history, I have an example, which is something called the Highlands and Islands Development Board that was created in the 1960s. And it still exists to this day. It's called Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And it was established as it was understood in London that the state of the Highlands and Islands was a scar on Scotland and Britain's conscience. And these powers, quite big powers with a reasonable budget in the context for development, but one of the strands it had, still has to this day, is community development as well. So Scotland has another enterprise agency, well, actually it's got two more now, but it's got something called Scottish Enterprise as well. But Highlands and Islands Enterprise, or the HIDB as it was known, is unique because it had this community. So it basically understood that community and industry were together. Now that has never been abolished by any government since the 1960s because of its power.
Fantastic. And Kate, I would actually like you to pick up the point that wasn't a question as such, because in this room, we all obviously supported that notion of protecting and growing manufacturing. That's not actually an uncontroversial point, particularly in kind of Westminster and policy circles. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And, you know, there's still a kind of impression that manufacturing are the jobs of the past, basically. And I think, you know, the power and potential of this agenda is to show that it's the jobs of the future as well. And not all of those jobs will be, you know, in a factory like the factory your mum worked in. But I think what some of those jobs had was decent quality unionised jobs. And what we're trying to build is decent quality unionised jobs in these, in these industries and right across the economy as well. Can I just make one point about the kind of political change thing? So I think that is one of the reasons why the kind of partnership approach is so important. So if you think of two of the most successful social policy reforms of the last 2 decades, you've got the national minimum wage. That's got an institution where workers and business negotiate it and make a recommendation to government, and that's basically tied both sides into that process. The Pensions Commission, which gave us auto-enrolment. Auto-enrolment is not a perfect system, but that was delivered through a commission with a trade unionist, a business representative, and an independent academic. And again, it said that pensions was going to have to be a partnership between workers, business, and the government in the form of tax relief. And I think there is something about those structures and those institutions which are really, really important for building that long-term consensus. And it's because if you actually listen to those people, you're more likely to get the policy right, it's more likely to be popular, as George said, and it's more likely to actually work.
Fantastic. I'm going to draw us to a close there, but before we go, I did want to say a huge thank you to all of you for participating in your contributions and questions. A huge thanks to SSE for partnering with us on this event, and to all of our panellists. Before we congratulate them all, I would just like to make a small piece of housekeeping, which is that we've got a very quick turnaround for our next event, so if you wouldn't mind kind of moving on fairly rapidly, then that would be much appreciated. But huge thanks to everybody, and looking forward to another fascinating discussion next year.